All right, it's 3 o'clock, so let's get rolling here. So today I am talking about developing repertoire for the saxophone. Again, I'm Dr. Andrew Allen from Georgia College. I am assistant professor of saxophone and coordinator of woodwinds, brass, and percussion. And in my career thus far, I have really found one of the great joys of my artistic life to be bringing new repertoire into the world, working with fantastic composers, and trying to, in collaboration with them, push the boundaries of our instrument. So first of all, we need to start talking about what is repertoire development. Well, today we're going to be talking about transcribing and arranging on one hand, and we're going to be talking about commissioning literature on the other. And I think in both regards, you need to be very careful, and you need to think strategically, and perhaps you even need to think philosophically. So first of all, why do we need new repertoire? I think anybody who's been a student of saxophone for any length of time knows that our instrument is a very recent invention. It came along in the 1830s, really started to hit its stride in the 1850s and 1860s. And from the very beginning, the people who were responsible for the saxophone and its development and growth were thinking this new instrument needs its own literature. So of course, Adolphe Sax, along with his teaching and his manufacturing and his inventing, he also owned a publishing company, Chez Adolphe Sax. And if any of you guys have ever played works by Saint-Gelais or Savary or de Meersemann, you're playing works by composers that Sax was friends with, that he commissioned, and he published their work. And then, of course, we have the Franco-Prussian War. Sax loses his position at the Paris Conservatory, where he was teaching mainly military musicians. And also a lot of his business concerns go down the drain because he had a lot of enemies and he was very close to the imperial regime. So we don't have a lot of new literature for the saxophone. And we begin to see this is really a time where the saxophone is in the wilderness. And if it hadn't been for the band movement, both in Europe and then in the United States by the 1880s, the saxophone may not have made it. We found a home within the band, but it really wasn't until the 19-teens when we have somebody like Elise Boyer Hall, who was an incredibly loving amateur saxophonist and great commissioner. We have, of course, Debussy, we have Vincent Diendy, we have Caplet, we have all of this really fantastic literature thanks to her. So already by the time we get to the 1920s, we're dealing with a handful of really high quality artistic pieces. And perhaps in that whole ball of wax, we could only say the music commissioned by Elise Boyer Hall is of very high quality. Whatever you think of the technical attributes of it, something like the Debussy is great art from a great composer. Something like the Florence Schmidt Legende is a fantastic piece of music. So already from the beginning, we're seeing how important it is. These prime movers in the saxophone world, these people who decide they love the instrument and they want to take it on as their own and they want to see it grow and prosper. And I think that all of us who are students, all of those of us who are teachers, all of those of us who are performers of the instrument, we're an odd breed. We're a little bit of an odd tribe. We love this instrument. We want it to grow and progress. Now, of course, by the 1930s, you have a lot of great artists in the jazz world finding a new home for the saxophone. But there were a lot of other people who said, you know, we want this to be an all-around instrument. You have these great artists in jazz all the way to the present, of course. And that's a great, great, great tradition for saxophone. But why can't we have it all? Why can't we play in the classical and pop and rock and jazz realms and just be an all-around instrument, just like any other, just like a trumpet or a trombone or a percussion or a string bass? Why can't we have that wealth of literature that everybody else has? So then, of course, we have the big three that we always talk about: Sigurd Roscher, Marcel Mule, Larry Teal. And all three of them in their own way played a very large part in repertoire development. Now, of course, when we think of Larry Teal, we don't think of commissioning a great body of literature. Really, we think of the Haydn Sonata as being one of the few pieces that was actively written for Teal. But then you go through any filing cabinet, you go through my filing cabinet, you go through the filing cabinet of any of your teachers, you go through the filing cabinet of virtually any band room with a high-quality music library in the country, and you're going to find scads of things that Larry Teal had a hand in developing. Solos for the alto saxophone player, solos for the tenor saxophone player, the intermediate solos, all the things that he did with Elaine Zajac, some great developmental literature that fills some gaps in our own, like his great transcription of the Saint-Saëns clarinet sonata, and all of these transcriptions and arrangements. Same thing with Mule. Of course, we recognize Mule as a great commissioner of repertoire, whether for himself personally or his studio at the Paris Conservatory. Something like Days and Clos, obviously, one of the great pieces in our literature, was written as a pedagogical tool originally, as a finals piece, as a jury piece, as we're all experiencing right now. But of course, you look at all of the fantastic literature that he himself transcribed and arranged. I was just looking at some old pictures of some old recital programs that I did, and all those beautiful transcriptions of Handel and Bach and all of this classical literature, because he was trying to fill in the gaps. And even a lot of the etudes that we're very familiar with, the Berbeguers, he was taking violin etudes and repurposing them for the saxophone. And then, of course, Sigurd Roscher, the person who probably the bedrock of our literature is most indebted to after Elise Hall, the Ibert, the Milhaud, on and on, the Glazunov, for crying out loud. All of this great fundamental literature that we still think every saxophonist should be playing. Of course, he worked tirelessly throughout his life to develop that. And also, I almost guarantee almost all of us at some point have probably played the Handel Sonata No. 3. We played the Eccles. We played all of these other things that he brought back from the past and repurposed for saxophone. So having said all of that, obviously I could keep talking about history and keep going far, 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 and probably take up 4 hours of your time doing that, but that's not what the purpose of today is. We need to talk about philosophy, and we need to talk about what those people were doing that we can learn from and we can use as contemporary saxophonists. Just realizing I meant to put my suit jacket on. Andrew Allen without a tie, without a suit jacket. Oh my goodness. Anyway, so we need to take lessons and start thinking about what they were doing, what they were intentionally doing that we can replicate and use to make this literature better and better and better. So I'm going to say something that I think we all know is true. We have a lot of literature. We really do. You look at the Londex guide from 2012, and we have thousands of pieces that have been written since then. And it's a repertoire guide that thick. I have it across from me on my kitchen table right now. Now, could we say that all of that is really great literature? No. I think we do have a lot of great pieces. I could name my own ones that I think are really, really high quality literature. And I'm not going to be the arbiter of this is good, this is bad. I tell my students all the time, that's not what we do. There's music that speaks to you, there's music that speaks to me. Sometimes those are the same, sometimes those are different. But I think we could all kind of identify those things that we think are of very high artistic quality, and then maybe the things that are of lesser artistic quality, but they keep kind of hanging around, you know, just because they fill a very specific role. So one of the things that you need to think about when we're doing all of this repertoire development, we need to think about, okay, are we going to have repertoire that fills a specific purpose, and we're going to have repertoire that keeps pushing the instrument forward? So in terms of transcription and arrangements, I think one of the biggest roles that that activity has is to fill in the gaps. You know, if we look at our colleagues who have this wealth of literature, our flutist colleagues, our violinist colleagues, our pianist colleagues, they have all of this literature from this huge span of artistic time. You know, I'm often a little bit jealous of that, or a lot of bit jealous of that. My wife is a flutist, and in her filing cabinet in our office here at home, she has so much good music. She has Bach. She has Mozart. She has all of this great stuff that I wish the saxophone had. And you know, there's a lot to be said for growing up in that classical tradition. I'm someone who's very oriented towards contemporary music and jazz myself, but I think that to develop your expressive potentialities, you really need to be thinking about how do you play a phrase? How do you shape a line? And there's no literature that's better for that than Baroque or classical literature. So we have a lot of really great transcriptions and arrangements from that time period. Again, thinking about Sigurd Roscher and Marcel Mule, so much of their activity writing pedagogical material was to try to make sure that they developed this linear approach, that you had music that was available to the saxophone from the Baroque period and the classical period and the Romantic period. And again, we have some original Romantic literature. We've got Saint-Gelais and Savary, but that's not Schubert. Young pianists can play Schubert and Schumann. And you know, that level of artistic grandeur, I think, is really important, that we need to have things that we can reach back in time and steal, to really develop our own potentialities as musicians. Because, you know, one of the things that circulated on this page and many others, we've been sharing recordings with each other. And some of the things that have motivated me and inspired me the most in my artistic life have been recordings of Schubert by Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau. And you're thinking about that level of artistic depth, and that can teach you a lot. So why would we transcribe? Well, to fill in a gap pedagogically. And I think there's still some gaps that exist. Another reason we could transcribe is to make sure that anything that's being neglected, that's been written for other instruments, maybe we make a home for it. I think a really great example of this is the music of Mark Mellitz. You had a piece like Tight Sweater, or you had a piece like the string quartet that Groove Machine comes out of, that was being virtually ignored by string players. And we took it in, gave it a home. It's great literature. And then, of course, that inspires him to write a lot for saxophone, because he sees that we're very willing to take on his artistic vision. I think, you know, you can make a case for a lot of pieces. Something like Strange Humors by John Mackey. You know, that thing gets played all the time, and I really don't think that gets played for its original of string quartet and djembe very often. So that's another really important way in which we can go about taking pieces and bringing them into our own literature in a way that that can really expand our possibilities and potentialities. Now, there is a danger to this, obviously. Again, talking about our flutist and violinist and pianist brothers and sisters and colleagues, their literature really isn't dependent upon that much in the way of transcription. A little bit, you know, and you could make a little bit of a pedantic argument about, well, you know, Bach wasn't originally written for piano. Of course it wasn't. Of course it wasn't. But if we rely too heavily on transcription, I think that does us a disservice. I think there's very much a place for it, and I think you can explore a lot of artistic potentialities. But again, I think a lot of our efforts need to be focused on moving forward and finding the best literature that we can, keeping the great stuff from the past that's moving and deep, and that you can express something of the human spirit through, and then maybe slowly jettisoning some of these things that don't. And I think, not to go off on a tangent too much, but I think it's also important, people, I think I saw Nicholas Prost is looking at this, hello. He and so many others have done so much important work of bringing great music that has been neglected in the past back. And we think of the De Crook and all of her fantastic music. And that was virtually unknown. I believe there was maybe one recording of the De Crook. Marcel Mule did 2 movements of it. And it was virtually unknown until 20, 25 years ago. So that's a conversation for another day. But anyway, so thinking about what may or may not work for transcriptions, I think it's very vital to start thinking about what works as a saxophonist. So unfortunately, I think a lot of people who aren't saxophonists may think, oh, clarinet, it'll work beautifully. And for any of you who've ever had a clarinetist friend play the Barrio Sequenza 9 while you were playing Sequenza 9B, I think that is a really great argument for how they are very different. Obviously, Sequenza 9 is built around the acoustics of the instrument. The very first gesture that you have is this beautiful, completely idiomatic fall in the clarinet down to the low E and bringing that down to nothing. And of course, when we try that, you play a low B, try to bring it down to nothing. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So obviously, I wouldn't say the clarinet works that well. Voice works beautifully. Flute works beautifully. Violin works beautifully. And I think a lot of you who've spent some time on these kinds of things know that. I mentioned the Saint-Saëns clarinet sonata a few minutes ago. That's really one of the few clarinet things that I use that I think works particularly well. And that's because he transposed the piano part, which some of my piano colleagues don't like sometimes. Anyway, so let's go on to commissioning new repertoire and some things that you may want to think about as you go forward. So first of all, you need to think about where you're going to find a composer. And before I go any further, I kind of want to ask the question, why can't it be you? Why can't you be a composer? Especially all of those students that I'm talking to out there. In my own studio, we have also great composition faculty at Georgia College, and I've got a couple students who are both saxophonists and composers. And that's really fascinating to watch their development as young musicians, because they're thinking with a different mind all the time. I have a freshman that She's thinking as a developing saxophonist, and she's also thinking as a developing theoretician and composer, and she's got this very unique perspective. But I think it's something that we could all do, at least to some degree. So how would you go about this if you want to create your own literature as a performing saxophonist composer? Well, first of all, turn some kind of recording device on. I think we've all grown fairly adept at streaming and recording in the last few weeks. But turn some kind of recording device on and improvise. Just improvise 5, 10, 15 minutes. Shut it off, listen to it. See if there's anything you like in there. And if there is, maybe you can turn that into a motive. And then maybe you can write it down on paper. And maybe you can play around with the motive and experiment and improvise and record on that. And, you know, I think most of you guys are pretty smart musicians. And I think you know a lot about motivic development from the music you've already studied. See what works. Don't get caught up in all kinds of special effects and don't try to do everything that you can do in the moment. Just try to take 1 or 2 ideas and develop them and see where they lead you. And obviously, if you're an undergraduate or even a graduate student, see if you can take some composition lessons. Even if you can't take them formally, go talk to your composer friends and see if they can show you a few pointers. Say, hey, do you mind looking at this? How could I improve this? And obviously have other saxophonists take a look at it. I'm very close with a lot of percussionists. If any of you guys know my work, one of the things that I spend a lot of my time doing is percussion and saxophone literature with Rogue 2, with my great friend and brother-in-arms, Gordon Hicken. And Gordon's introduced me to a lot of very, very fantastic percussionist composers. And there's a very rich tradition of that in the percussion world. And I think it's still something that we could tap into more. Obviously, they're fantastic saxophonist composers. Here in the US, Jeff Leffert. If you guys haven't heard Dr. Leffert's music, he's a wonderful composer. My friend Michael Torres, fantastic composer saxophonist. Overseas, of course, we have Philippe Geiss. We have Vincent David. Vincent, I actually have this album right on the table for another reason. Just came out with an album of his own works. And I could keep going, obviously, but there's so many people already that are fantastic performers and fantastic composers. So why not use yourself as a resource? Now, I will say, there are many of us who are ungifted as composers, and physician heal thyself, right? I took 1 semester of composition lessons in undergrad and figured out that was not where my talents lie. I think I wrote 1 piece that the sketch is hopefully in a landfill rotting somewhere because it was no bueno. But for those of us who are unskilled as composers, what can we do to start thinking about how to develop literature? Well, number 1, again, you need to find a composer. So, are you still in school? If so, for this and for so many other reasons, there are so many things that you can do while you're in school that you can never do for the rest of your life, so you need to take advantage of opportunities. If you're at a school with a composition program, you're never going to be around that many composers every day of your life again. You won't. You won't. You won't. So why not go ahead and start talking to them and see if there are any that you have a natural kinship and friendship with. Because I'm still going to sit here and tell you that the best music comes from good relationships. It comes from good friendships. It comes from good musical collaboratory potentiality, if I want to say that in an Andrew Allen kind of way. So go around, and even if there isn't a composition program, talk to your friends and see who writes music. Because in any music program throughout this country, there are people who are writing music, even if they're not in a composition studio. So why not go ahead and start talking to them and saying, hey, you want to write something for me? Undergraduate and graduate composition majors at schools that have them are always needing to write new music anyway. So again, if you have friends who are composition majors, they got to write stuff for their recitals. They have to. So why not go ahead and be proactive and start talking and saying, hey, you know, you're going to have that junior recital coming up. You got all the music you need for that? And if not, say, I'd love to help you out. I would love to help you out. Why don't you write something for me? Why don't you write something for solo saxophone? Why don't you write something for my saxophone quartet? And keep it fairly simple, especially with student composers. You may not want to ask them to write a mixed chamber ensemble for a whole bunch of instruments that they haven't delved into very deeply. But again, a solo work, a chamber work, that'll work pretty well. So why not do it? They're also usually going to be pretty happy to write for free, which is something we will talk about in just a minute. But again, price is always something that you have to think about when you are commissioning repertoire. I would say it's really important to start with people you know whose music you see potential in. It's usually not going to do anything to cold email or cold call a composer you've never met in your life. If I got an email asking for something from somebody I'd never met, I would probably think it was some kind of scam, and I would just never respond. And I think composers are the same way. Also, if you don't know their music, why would you be asking them to write you a piece? No, go ahead and listen to some of their music first, and if you're digging it, hey, you're probably going to like something that they write for saxophone too. But again, I think it's really important to start thinking about building relationships, building long-term relationships with other musicians, period, because that's where the best collaborations come from. People that you like, who are very well skilled, who you enjoy working with, that's going to be a pleasurable, reciprocal relationship for many years. To go back to kind of the historical point of view, just to put it in perspective, some of the greatest pieces of music for solo instruments have been written because of these kind of relationships between musicians. So if we're thinking about the Brandenburg Concerti, Bach was really good friends with a trumpeter named Gottfried Reike. And Reike was his first trumpet player in Leipzig, and he writes all of this great music for trumpet in all of these oratorios, all of these passions, all of this beautiful stuff, and he pushes the trumpet forward because he knew Reike's abilities, and Reike was an incredibly skilled trumpet player, but it pushes the entire art of trumpet playing forward. We have Anton Stadler, who is a clarinetist who was friends with Mozart. We have all of Mozart's wonderful pieces for clarinet, including the concerto, that again push the instrument forward. We have Brahms and clarinetist Richard Mohlfeld. Again, this incredibly involved couple of pieces of chamber music that start to change what the potentialities are for wind sonatas. We have, in the 20th century, we've got Severino Gazzolone, who collaborated with Berio on Sequenza 1, who collaborated with Bruno Maderna on all kinds of fantastic solo literature, and with Boulez. We've got Kathy Berberian, who Sequenza 3 was written for, and most of the fantastic vocal music Cage wrote for, everybody wrote for. But again, there are these relationships. It's when a great musical mind in a composer comes together with a great musical, artistic, and interpretatory mind in a performer, and you meet together for drinks, you meet together for lunch, you walk to class together, you talk about what kind of music you're both into, they hear you play in recital, you hear their music, and this kind of coming together of musical minds is usually what's going to eventually down the road result in the best musical results. Other great places to meet composers. Some of this is moot right now, but also there are some opportunities maybe this summer that didn't exist before. So I would say normally music festivals, concerts, if there's an orchestra, opera company anywhere near where you're in school, for those of you still in school, even for those of you out of school, go to those concerts. You're probably going to end up meeting people in the lobby. Go to composers conferences. When you start performing pieces by composer friends, say, hey, I'd love to go to the Society of Composers International Regional Conference and play this thing for you. Hey, I would love to go to this Student Composers Symposium. I would love to go to this thing. And go ahead and be very willing to get out and play their music out in the world. Number one, because it's just the right thing to do. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But also, you're going to meet more composers doing that. Success breeds success, we know that. And also, putting one composer's work out into the world will usually yield more pieces down the line. Also, it's really nice, you go to anything. You go to a concert, you go to a festival, you go to any kind of summer workshop, you hear a really nice piece of music by somebody in attendance at one of those things, make friends with them. If you like them and you like their music, see if they're going to be willing to write something for you. The more you expose yourself to, in general, as a musician, the better off you are. We all know that. But in general, if a composer's previous works of any sort for any instrumental combination strike your fancy, you're probably going to like what they would do for saxophone, so why not? All right, now we come to the big one. Money. Money. Money makes the world go round. Not really. But obviously, any artist deserves to be paid for their work. And I wouldn't do a gig for free unless it was a big favor to a friend. I might play for a friend's wedding as a gift to them, but that's the only time I'm going to play for free. So why should we expect a composer to write for free? Now, that's a little bit of a loaded question. If you were to listen to somebody like Sigurd Roscher, Roscher never paid for a piece. He always said that all of the pieces that were written for him were written because the composer was so taken by his prowess. And that is true. The other part of that was the composer received a lot of other benefit from writing a piece for Roscher. So I'm not saying you need to go out and write a check for every single piece that you commission. I've commissioned more than 24 works. I have paid for 3 pieces. The others have been written out of the kindness of other people's hearts, or we figured out other ways to fund them. So what are those other ways? Number one, if you're working with mainly student composers or composition faculty members, sometimes they have a lot more flexibility. A lot of people who have written for me are college professors, so they have another income stream. They want to keep producing works because number one, they're composers and that's what they do, and number two, they want their work to get out in the world. You have that all-important tenure file that you're trying to get tenure and promotion. You're trying to get full prof. So maybe there's another outside resource of money. Great, if I get tenure, I'm basically being paid for that work. And sometimes composers do feel that way. Also, there are composers out there that if you play their work enough and get it out into the world, they're very appreciative of that. And especially if they have another income stream, they're often very willing to write for you. Now, obviously, there are a lot of grants out there, and I would say that's a great first go-around. Chamber Music America has a grant series if you're doing anything for 2 musicians to 11, I think. You have to be a member, you got to pay dues every year. But as grants, if you have any... Are we good? All right, cool. I lost the connection for a second, sorry. If you have any kind of desire to be an academic at some point, you need to be writing grants anyway, because those look good on your own TMP file. But also there are local grants. There's state grants. If any of our friends from Canada are watching, you guys have outstanding federal arts grants that we do not have in the United States. But explore all those options. Now, you haven't said commissioning consortiums yet. Well, I'm about to. We need to be careful with those. There is definitely a time and a place to do those, and there's a time and a place not to. No matter what you feel about commissioning consortiums, you need to think again about philosophy. So, who is this piece for? If you as a performer are going to receive most of the professional benefit from premiering this work and getting it out into the world, what's the motivation of other people to be in on that commission? Not to point fingers at anybody too much, but I'm sure we've all had those friends that there is a large item that they want that instead of saving up for, they put a call to arms on GoFundMe. And, you know, obviously a lot of times there's a reason for that. Sometimes it rubs us the wrong way, right? And you always want to make sure that a consortium never breaches into that territory. If you're organizing a commissioning consortium, anybody involved needs to see a clear musical benefit from that. You need to have some kind of regional premiering ability. It needs to be some kind of lock. They need to be very limited in the size of people that they take on. You need to get something other than a score and say, hey, you get to play this when I'm done playing it. Also, we need to think about the size and scope of commissions. Josh Thomas has a fantastic commissioning consortium going right now because he's trying to build up some really high quality pedagogical works. Spread it around a little bit, get pieces for a very specific purpose, so we can better serve our students with quality music. I think that's fantastic. That's an incredibly valid and wonderful use of a commissioning consortium. I think another really great opportunity is when you have a very high name recognition composer willing to write a concerto. You identify 10 or a dozen ensembles and soloists who are willing to lay down money on the barrel, and that gets us a huge work into the repertoire. So again, you need to be very careful. In my own experience, occasionally I've tried to do commissioning consortiums with younger composers who hadn't achieved a lot of name recognition yet, and a lot of the time you're gonna not get the money that you want out of that. People aren't gonna respond the way you want them to. So again, when you're doing commissioning consortiums, be very clear in your goals. Make sure that there's a lot of benefit to whoever signs on for it. That benefit that won't just be achieved by them waiting a couple years and then buying the piece later. And then also you need to be very careful when you're doing commissions, because you can get yourself into a little bit of legal tangle. I wouldn't hold any money myself. I would either go with some kind of crowdfunding platform that'll kind of keep everything in escrow for you, or if it's a really high dollar amount, you may want to talk to a financial planner or a lawyer friend and see what they can tell you about escrow accounts, because we want to make sure that if something falls through, it's really easy to get people their money back, that we pay our composers, that everything's above board. You always want to think about that. So something else that you could always think about, I haven't been this lucky yet, but there have been a lot of really fantastic pieces written for us thanks to wealthy friends and patrons of the arts. Again, going back to Elise Hall, she was quite wealthy. She was a very enthusiastic performer. She's quite wealthy. So she was able to commission a lot of these high-dollar composers. One of our more recent, what I think is very successful concerto with wind ensemble, I won't mention any names, is thanks to the largesse of a wonderful amateur saxophonist and attorney who just loves the instrument. So he does a lot to fund new works. So if you have that working for you, why not use it? If somebody really loves the instrument and they really like you, see if you can develop some kind of relationship. Yeah, why not? But even if a piece ends up being too expensive, you'll never know unless you ask. One of the problems that I do run into every once in a while if I'm working with a younger composer, this doesn't really happen to me anymore. Sometimes you'll get spitballed a number that'll kind of take your socks off. I think some young composers don't totally know that there is kind of a set market rate for these things. Obviously, solo pieces are the least expensive. Chamber pieces get a little bit more expensive. Larger and larger ensembles get more expensive. And then the other coefficient is time. The shorter the work is, the less expensive it is. The longer the work is, the more expensive it is. And the Society of Composers International actually publishes a recommended commissioning guide. They actually say this much time, this kind of piece, this is a really good ballpark figure for you to ask. So I would really, again, if somebody who is a young composer spitballs you a really high number, that's fine. If it's somebody you still want to work with, maybe there can be a little bit of back and forth there. Because again, everybody deserves to get compensated for their work. Everybody does. You do, I do, our composer friends do, period. Now, once you kind of arrived on the money issue, and number one, if they don't mention money up front, it is something that you want to talk about, because you don't want to be halfway through the process and then say, and this is going to cost you $2,000. I've almost never dealt with that. Most composers are fantastic about laying out those expectations up front, but if they don't, you need to. Don't be afraid to. But you also need to start thinking about parameters for a piece. So instrumentation, solo piece, chamber piece. What instruments are you going to be using? Length, how long do you want it to be? The time frame, when do you want this thing by? And other basic factors. Most of the time when I'm commissioning, I'm thinking about a very specific time and place that I'm going to be premiering the work. So I always try to make sure in my own personal thinking, all right, I need to make sure that I can travel with this work. So while I love personally live electronics pieces, I get a little scared about doing them, unless I'm going to be doing them in my own hall, on my own campus, and I can control all of the parameters. Usually not something that I want to travel with if it has live video, live audio. I prefer something fixed there. I also think about the instruments. All right, so I'm going to be performing with the Carolina Quartet, which I play tenor in. I'm going to be doing this thing on soprano. I don't want to take a third horn. And these are very practical considerations that you need to think about when you're lining these things up. You want to be able to get this thing out and play as much as possible, so make sure that you're going to be able to do that. And again, if you look at most of the music that I've commissioned in my life, it's somewhere between 6 minutes and 11 minutes long. Number one, because most of these things get premiered at NASA conferences, CMS conferences, on faculty recitals. So again, something you need to think about. You need to make sure that instrumentation isn't so unwieldy that the thing gets played once or twice and it's gone. Again, it is partially your responsibility to make sure that this piece has a life past you, and you need to be thinking about that up front. Other basic factors. Generally, I don't like to micromanage my composers, and I really usually don't like works that I can tell have been micromanaged. If you're asking somebody to write a piece for you, you're not writing that piece. If you want to write your own piece, write your own pieces. We already talked about that. But let the composer write their music for you. Now, some composers are different. Obviously, you want them to write their work for you. So there does need to be a back and forth. You need to give them recordings of yourself. You need to share pieces that you love. And many composers will ask for that up front. But then after that, hands off. Maybe if there's some kind of framing device. Some composers like that. I'm very fond of giving literary framing devices. If I know that the composer and I have some kind of touchstone in common. I like poetry and fiction as a starting place a lot of the time. If I know the composer is also literary minded the same way that I am. But beyond that, you need to make yourself available. Make sure that you're talking with the composer as they want to. Make sure you're reaching out and saying, how's it going? Anything I can help you with? Anything you got questions about? A lot of the times, even if it's a very well-seasoned composer that's written for the saxophone, they may want to know what you do well. So again, send them recordings, and never be afraid to send them resource guides. Especially if the composer hasn't written a ton for the saxophone, I always tell them to hit up Marcus Weiss and Giorgio Netti's The Techniques of Saxophone Playing. I found that to be an incredibly useful, usable, practical guide that if it's in that book, it might be hard, but I can figure out how to do it because all the stuff in there works. So have something that's very similar to you that you can guide composers to use as some kind of resource. But again, have an open door policy. Hopefully they're sending you sketches and you can work things out as you go. Another thing that I would caution, make sure that you're not too quick to tell somebody something's impossible. I have run into maybe one or two things that may have been impossible, and maybe one little fix made it work. I think most things, though, are just very difficult. And commissioned repertoire can be another great way of pushing yourself forward as a musician, as an artist. So don't just fall into the comfortable. Say, well, it isn't really idiomatic on saxophone. Now, if they write you a trill between low C and low E flat, tell them, yeah, that's never going to sound great. I can kind of sort of do it, but it's never really going to sound like a trill. Don't be afraid to say something like that. But otherwise, be open. Be open to new things. Why not? So, you need to make sure that you get the work in plenty of time so you prepare. And that needs to be part of your original conversations. I think any composers would understand that you need time to sit and live with any work and make sure that you perform it up to your own artistic standards as well as theirs before it goes out to the world. But you need to make sure that once it is ready at that level, that you get it out into the world as much as possible. So have your first performance. But there's so many pieces in any idiom that receive one performance and that's it. I bet if we were to flip through the Londex guide, there were even in there, this well-documented resource, I bet there would be an incredibly high number of pieces that have been played more than a few times. And I think that's a shame, because I think any piece of art deserves a life. What if I'm thinking maybe a great piece of visual art. A painter paints it, he shows it to one person, it goes in a closet forever. You would think that was a tragedy. That would be terrible. Somebody writes a novel that nobody ever reads. That'd be awful. That would really be awful. And it's the same with a piece of music. If you have a quality piece of music, it needs to have a life. So this is where your responsibility comes in. Your number one responsibility is to be the finest interpreter of the composer's work that you can be. You have worked on that piece. You have delved into that piece. You've spent time, you've spent resources, blood, sweat, and tears to make it the greatest performance that you can. And then your second responsibility is to keep lining up performances of that work. When I find a piece that I really like, I keep performing it. And I keep trying to get it in front of audiences, both specialist audiences of saxophonists, so hopefully they'll latch onto the work as well, and non-specialist audiences. The more that you play the work, number one, the more it becomes your own. And this is true even of things that we don't commission. We know that. But if you keep performing it and keep performing it and keep performing it, it's going to develop and it's going to grow. And all of these other people are going to hear it and it's going to start to catch fire. And that's what we want. Another thing that you definitely need to do, you definitely need to record performances anytime that you're performing new works. I don't care if it's live, I don't care if it's studio, you need to record them. And you need to get them out to your composers so they can continue to get these things out into the world. I've just had a couple of composers that I'm very close to that have written a lot of works for me. These things are getting published by major houses. And again, this is something that our composer friends are still worried about. It doesn't matter if they're self-publishing, if they're publishing with a house. They need a way of getting that music out there. Again, this is their livelihood. This is their passion just as much as this is ours. And they need to be able to get their work out into the world. The last kind of thing I want to throw in your general direction before I take a few questions is, eventually you need to start thinking about your own aesthetic. It's a great thing to commission new repertoire, and it's a great thing to get all these new works, but we want to make sure that we're not the crazy cat people of the musical world. We want to make sure after a certain point that we're not taking anything at all. Now, if that works for you, awesome, great. If it's of high artistic standard, welcome to the repertoire. That's all I have to say. But for me, I definitely find that the things I enjoy the most fall within a few kind of aesthetic parameters. I find I've had a lot of success working with composers who've been influenced by Georges Apergui and a lot of other post-spectralist composers who were influenced by Brian Ferneyhough. I've had a lot of success with composers who were students of Stephen Stuckey, and also composers who were influenced by Morton Feldman, composers who were influenced by experimental jazz traditions. Somebody like Igor Karacha, who I've collaborated with a whole lot. He's very influenced by Cecil Taylor and a lot of other free jazz performers. Somebody like the great Robert LeMay, very highly influenced by Ferneyhough and a lot of post-spectralism, but also film. And I tell you, you talk to your composer friends who are really brilliant and you will learn so many new things about artistic life because they'll open up so many new purviews to you. But anyway, I've been sitting here talking for 42 minutes. So I'd love to see if any of you guys have questions about this whole process. If I can't answer anything that you've got, I'm going to try my darndest, or I'll figure out if I can point you in another direction. Anybody got any questions? Nobody's got questions? Well, if anybody has questions in the future, please feel free. Shoot me a message. Shoot me a message through Facebook. Shoot me an email. Whatever you guys want to do. I am always happy to help any of you guys as you develop as musicians and artists. Anything that I can do to help, to keep pushing you and keep pushing our instrument forward, I want to do. So I hope that you're all well and healthy and safe in all of this mess. Keep your chins up. You know, the more that we play music, the more that we read good books, watch good film, and really pay attention to all of this great stuff that we have in life that flows from art, the better off we are. And there are brighter days ahead. Read. Reed, one of my students at Georgia College, one of my kids, hey Reed, is asking, what's the first piece that I really connected to as a performer? That's a really good question. I have to think way back in time on this one. You know, I would say probably the earliest thing, as nerdy as it sounds, it was band piece. I really connected with, I was in 8th grade and I connected with this Claire Grundman piece, and I thought it had a lot of emotional depth, and I kind of got hooked from there. First saxophone piece that I really fell in love with, you know, I think it was the second movement of the Creston Sonata when I was a sophomore in high school. Had a lot of pathos. I read that Creston had composed the sonata right after he had a very small child pass away. And I thought I saw in that second movement all of this emotional turmoil. And I felt that very deeply, even at a young age. As I get older, you know, there's a lot of saxophone literature, and there's a lot of stuff that has nothing to do with saxophone that keeps drawing me in. I think the composer who only wrote one work for saxophone that I'm continuously drawn into is somebody like Debussy, especially Debussy's piano works. I think he wrote so effectively and so movingly for the instrument. Schubert. I think somebody who lived such a short life and had such a deep understanding of the human condition and could write music that expressed that so movingly. You know, in the saxophone world, something like the Albright Sonata, I think something, again, that somebody who experienced life very, very deeply, and sometimes not in the most healthy ways, but definitely a piece of music that I think really expresses something unsayable about being a human being on Earth. And we get to be the amusis for that composer and bring their thoughts and their feelings out into the world, and hit people right in their cerebral cortex. I think that's a very powerful thing. Sorry, Reed. That's the kind of answer you get in your lessons, man. I hope that. Well, anybody got anything else? Okay, guys. Well, like I said, we're in the middle of finals right now. So if you're in finals, best of luck, break a reed. If you're not in finals, keep your head down, keep moving forward. Make sure that you've got projects for yourself coming up. You know, obviously do what you need to keep yourself healthy and well. But at least for me, I have found that the more stuff I had to look forward to off into the middle distance and off into the future, the happier I am. So anyway. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I hope that this was useful and that this worked. Anyway, but thank you guys. All the best. Everybody stay safe and healthy and well. And I really look forward to seeing every single one of you in person very soon. But you guys have a great day, and we will see you later. Bye-bye.